Hello, I'm Andy Agafangelo. I'm the founder of the Transparency Task Force, which is a collaborative campaigning community dedicated to helping reform the way the financial sector works right around the world. It's my absolute pleasure to be hosting this event today. About 18 months or so ago, I stumbled across Violation Tracker, the US version, and fell in love with it straight away. It's an incredibly powerful database, a wonderful free public utility that's of great interest to anybody who's interested in things like governance and campaigning and basically helping to make the world a better place. And over the last 18 months or so, I've had the real pleasure and privilege of liaising quite a bit with the people in Washington, DC, who are responsible for this wonderful success story of Violation Tracker. You'll be hearing from those guys in a short while. So I'm really pleased that you're all here. For those of you that are already a little bit familiar with Violation Tracker and Violation Tracker UK, today's section has a slight nuance towards civil society groups. So that's the kind of the cohort that this particular event has been aimed at, so to speak. So in a moment, we're going to be hearing from Greg Leroy, then Phil Matera, then Anish Raghavan, and then we have 5 or 6 others who will be chipping in with their thoughts as well about how they plan to use the database and what they particularly like about it. I do want this session to be as interactive and as engaging as possible. So please don't hesitate to wave your hand or do it digitally if you prefer. Let us know when you want to make a comment or a question. And don't be surprised if I pick on you if I think there might be something you'd like to say as well. Here goes. All right. So Phil, could I first of all I'm actually going to invite Greg to go first. Greg, can you introduce yourself, tell everybody a bit about the background to all this? Of course, please do comment about the organisations that have helped to make Violation Tracker UK a possibility as well. Greg, over to you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andy. And again, I'm the director of Good Jobs First. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan 501c3 public charity based in Washington, D.C. And I want to thank Andy for beginning to shake us by the lapels 18 months ago. We also want to thank 3 financial backers who made this website and database possible. That's the Jaffe Trust, the Joseph Roundtree Charitable Trust, and the Riva and David Logan Foundation. Professor Raghunandan also was an academic advisor to this project, and I'm glad to see that Anthony K. Bagley is on the call today. He was our lead UK-based researcher. And with that, I'll hand it over to Phil.
Okay, thanks, Greg. So I'm Phil Matera. I'm the research director at Good Jobs First, and I head our corporate research project, which is the entity responsible for both the UK Violation Tracker and the original US Violation Tracker on which it is modeled. So I'm going to give a quick overview of what's in the UK site for those of you who have not had a chance to look at it. So Violation Tracker UK is the first wide-ranging database of corporate misconduct in the United Kingdom. We've collected data from more than 40 regulatory agencies, and all of our information is in the form of original information from those agencies, and all of our individual entries, of which we have more than 63,000, linked back to official government documents or databases. The cases that we've collected reflect more than £12 billion in financial penalties, although many of the cases do not have any financial amounts attached to them, because we've learned that UK regulators like to make use of cautions and notices in which at least first-time offenders are not hit with any financial penalties. As in the US site, we aggregate the cases according to parent companies, larger parent companies, and we've got more than 670 of those in the UK data. We tag each one of our entries with one of 6 broad offense categories. And here's a breakdown of the numbers that we have in all of those. You'll see that the safety category, which includes workplace safety, is the largest category in terms of numbers of cases. Employment is second. But actually, in terms of financial penalties, it's actually competition and financial cases that are at the top. There are several ways of searching the database. We have a basic search where you can just put in a company name and by itself, or combine it with one of those offense categories and or a regulatory agency. We have a list of summary pages, one for each of those 670 parents, ones for each of the industry groups, the offense groups, the agencies, and even the countries in which the parents are headquartered. We also have an advanced search feature where you can mix and match all of those variables plus others to do a customized search. Here's an example of an individual entry. This is a rather large case with Barclays, where they were fined more than 284 million pounds for a case in which they were accused of manipulating the foreign exchange market. As you can see, we have a narrative description of the case, the name of the agency that brought it, and then at the bottom, there's a link to the document that we used to derive this information. In this case, it's a press release from the Financial Conduct Authority from 2015. Here's a list of the parents with the largest financial penalty, monetary penalty totals. Airbus is at the top because of a couple of big bribery cases. Nortel, which is no longer in business, but we left it in because it had a very large pension case. And then some other familiar names of UK companies like Barclays, Rolls-Royce, Lloyds, but also foreign companies like the Swiss bank UBS or the US bank JP Morgan Chase. So I'm gonna stop there. I think that gives you a sense of what's in the site, and I'll be happy to answer any questions during the Q&A.
In case anybody has anything they're itching to say at this point, whether it's a question or a comment, feel free to make yourself known. Just wave your hand at me or raise your hand digitally if you have anything you'd like to say before we move on to Anish. It looks like everyone's good, so let's go straight to Anish. Thank you very much indeed for that, Phil. Let's go to Anish. Anish, over to you.
Yeah, so I'll try to keep this brief. And so I wanted to just talk about a little bit how I've used Violation Tracker in the US and kind of a few insights from the UK and kind of more generally what I think the real benefits of Violation Tracker are vis-a-vis other sort of sources of data on companies and corporate conduct. So to give people some background, my name is Anish Raghavan. I am on the faculty at the London School of Economics. And I do a lot of work that tries to link basically companies' financial incentives, right? So things like profit targets or short-term, executive compensation. And I try to link this up to how they then treat other stakeholders, right? So what happens to employees, what happens to the environment? Basically, when companies have short-term incentives, who pays for them? That's a lot of what I do. And one kind of salient example that I thought would be pretty good for this audience would be to focus on some of my work on wage theft facilitated by a Violation Tracker. So I have some work out there showing using the US version of Violation Tracker and using specifically data on companies' wage and hour violations, showing that when companies or their executives have short-term incentives, right? So specifically when companies have short-term earnings pressure, right? The sort of strong desire to just meet or beat these targets, they seem to at least partially respond by finding ways to take the money away from their employees, to pay less, to not pay overtime, to not pay, to make people work through breaks, right? And this is also kind of exacerbated when the executives involved have lower personal liability for wage theft, or when their compensation kind of provides them with even stronger incentives to hit these short-term targets. Now, this is just one of many, many examples of how I and others have used Violation Tracker. But one thing that I wanted to kind of discuss, and one thing that I wanted to highlight as what I think is one of the most useful things about Violation Tracker is that the research I've just highlighted, and many others like it, it sort of relies on being able to use Violation Tracker to identify which companies are kind of up to no good. And what's interesting is that a lot of the corporate misconduct data in Violation Tracker right? The sort of what I view as kind of fundamental information picking up corporate conduct is not picked up by any sort of commercial environmental, social, and governance rating. So we have, for anyone who's kind of closer to the investment arena, you've likely heard of the explosion of interest in incorporating environmental, social, and governance factors into investment decisions, things like carbon emissions, or in the social sphere, things like labor practices or consumer relations records. But it turns out what I think is the most fundamental measure of some of these quantities is, well, where do we actually get hard data on how companies are actually treating their employees? And the answer to where we get that data is violation tracker, right? Everything else kind of relies on companies controlling the narrative and telling you what are we up to, right? And of course, a company isn't going to outright say, hey, we mistreat our employees. That's where we look to violation tracker to figure out what's going on. And the thing that I found fascinating is that there's absolutely no correlation between a company's violation history, right? There's no correlation between how the hard data on how companies actually treat their employees and their ratings in any of these commercial databases. And this, you can imagine this being a problem, especially for things like, if you think about the Boohoo scandal in the UK last summer, right? Boohoo is a company that was found to have, had some horrific labor practices up in Leicester, and yet it was included in pretty much every ethical investing index you could have thought of. And the reason being that these investors and these kinds of ESG rating agencies took Boohoo at their word when they just said, we treat our employees well, right? So if you want to actually figure out what these companies are up to, right, this is where the hard data lives. And this is kind of the value add of Violation Tracker in the US, and hopefully going forward in the UK as well. Now, I've done a little bit in just looking at the UK data. And one thing, I should highlight a couple of things that I've looked at so far. I haven't had a chance to write anything up, but once again, the thing that I thought was fascinating here was, well, violating firms seem to underperform, right? Underperformance seems to come at least partially in response to financial pressures, right? That may or may not be surprising depending on kind of where you, what you do every day and what you work on. But it's something to think of, right? When firms are struggling, who suffers? At least in part, it seems to be the employees. The other thing that's, I think, fascinating here, and I think what kind of underscores the importance of bringing Violation Tracker to the UK, is that once again, even in the UK, even in an environment where there's more external pressure for ESG related factors, even in a better ESG environment, so to speak, there's once again no correlation between commercial ESG ratings and what companies are actually up to. So, for example, HSE violations, employment tribunal settlements, the minimum wage violations as published by HMRC. None of these correlate. None of these have any correlation to how companies are scored by commercial vendors. And so the punchline that I really wanted to sort of maybe give you to take away with here, right, that's sort of practice oriented, is that the best way to me to figure out how companies are actually treating some of their most important non-shareholder stakeholders is to look up violations, to look at the hard data that they can't falsify, right? Look what they've actually been up to, look at the records, right? And just look at the data. And that's where I think Violation Tracker adds a ton of value to holding companies accountable where necessary. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to talk offline a lot more about any of this or any of my research or anything if that's of interest, but I'll stop here. And yeah, I'm happy to hand it over.
Anish, thank you very much indeed. That was crystal clear. Thank you very much. Again, I'm going to check in with everybody to see whether anybody would like to ask a question or make a point at this stage. I've got a question I'd like to put to Phil and/or Anish and Greg. Perhaps all three of you could comment on this. Could you talk about the potential for the data to be used for, if you like, predictive purposes? Greg, can I put that one to you first of all? Then I'll hear what Phil has to say, and then Anish as well. So talk to us about the potential for predictive usefulness of the database. Thank you.
I think that's an emerging possibility. I mean, I think the data that we're getting now, especially from other academic users as well as Anish, is that the data should have a higher predictive value because looking backwards compared to other ESG ratings, the data seems to bear out the issues that Anish did as well as others. I mean, we're getting, and Phil can speak to these more intimately, questions about morality and crime and all kinds of other interesting correlations people are starting to do, looking at the data, geographically as well as by sector and company. So we think, the sky's the limit. We have 336 academic users in 23 nations right now chewing on the original US version of the data.
Thank you, Greg. And to Phil, any comments, Phil, about the predictive capabilities of the database?
Well, certainly if the past is any indication of the future, then a lot of the companies that are showing up with current violations are going to show up again in the future. The US data in particular is in some sense just an index of recidivism. It shows for many of these large companies that they keep breaking the rules over and over again. And there's no reason to believe they're going to stop breaking the rules, because even though for certain kinds of cases, the financial penalties have been escalating in the US, that doesn't seem to have stopped the inclination of companies to go on cutting corners, to put it mildly. Apparently, a lot of companies have decided that it makes business sense to break the rules, to pay the penalties, and to go on doing what they're doing, because it's more profitable to go that way. So it's not, I don't think you can always predict, for an individual company exactly how its past record is going to affect the future. But in general, I think that there's an indication that companies overall that have broken the rules in the past are probably going to show up again in the future data.
Thank you very much. And just before we go to Anish, I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent just to bring a point to life that Phil's just touched on, that I personally find really, really important. So I'm going to share my screen if I may. I won't be long doing this, but hopefully this will be quite interesting. I honestly hadn't heard the word recidivism until I had my first ever conversation with Greg about 1.5 years ago. And Greg literally had to explain to me that recidivism is this idea that individuals or organizations carry on doing the things they're being told off for, the things that they're being punished for. And my favorite search, both in the Violation Tracker US version and the UK one, is the one I'm about to show you. So you go to the main page, you then go to this very, very useful bit here called Other Summaries. And if you go to Parent Industry Totals, can you see that there? Parent Industry Totals. But this thing is about as easy to navigate as Google. It really is so user-friendly. And what it's showing us here is a ranking of the different industry totals. And you'll see, by the way, financial services is way out in the lead in terms of being the most violating industry, which of course for me, for what my organization does, is very, very interesting. But then when you click on the financial services tab, as I hope you can see here, you get a list of the 10 worst offenders: Barclays, Lloyds, UBS, NatWest, JP Morgan Chase, Deutsche Bank, Credit Suisse, Citigroup, HSBC, Goldman Sachs. Now, these are all household names, but whenever I see their advertising now on the TV or in magazines or newspapers, I now think of them more in terms of how prominently they feature in the Violation Tracker database. And then even more interestingly, when you scroll down the list, you get this very, very long list ranked by size of offence. And what you see, ladies and gentlemen, is the pattern, exactly the same pattern as the Violation Tracker US database. And the pattern is that the same organizations are being caught by the same regulators for doing the same things over and over again. And this is really significant. Phil made the point so well earlier, and Greg made the point as well. This really does indicate that there are some organizations out there that seem to treat getting caught doing wrong as kind of like a business hazard that is in some way acceptable. And of course, it really isn't. It really does speak to, I think, two things: deep-rooted cultural problems within these organizations. And it arguably also points to a massive question mark over the efficacy of the regulatory framework as well. But that's another conversation for another time. I hope you found that of some interest. Anish, let's jump back to the question about predictive capability. What are your thoughts about this from an academic's perspective? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, so I think I'm going to mostly echo what Phil has said, right? Which is that recidivism at the corporate level is real, right? Now, it's interesting that and one thing that's cool about Violation Tracker in the US and the UK is that it picks up so many different sources of data. And so you can kind of consider recidivism not just with respect to a specific type of violation, right? You can kind of consider it more broadly. And some of my work actually suggests that firms are actually up to this, right? The idea is that if I do something bad if I do something bad, if let's say I have a workplace safety issue, I get in big trouble, I get caught. I know that the HIC, for example, or OSHA in the US is likely to be watching me a little bit more carefully. So if I need to cut corners, I may not do the same thing again. I may instead go and skimp on how I deal with pollution, right? Recidivism is, in a way, it's like a game of whack-a-mole, right? Where you sort of you move around, you do different things, and there's not necessarily much coordination across, like within regulators, let alone across regulators, right? And so it's much easier to have if using Violation Tracker to figure out if and when this is going on, right? Because the way I see it, when a company gets caught doing something wrong, one of two things happens, right? Number one is they fix it. Maybe they earnestly didn't know that they were doing something wrong, and then they kind of, nothing happens again. Number two is they just go cut corners somewhere else. And what Violation Tracker lets you do is it lets you separate which of these two types of, who's who, right? In the sense that let's say two companies have the same type of violation this year, right? How should we judge those two companies vis-a-vis each other? This can also be an important question when you have large companies where sometimes stuff just goes wrong, right? And when you're trying to figure out, how do we sort of judge these two companies? It's important to figure out what they're up to in future years. And in doing so, you need the full picture of what they're up to. And this is what Violation Tracker really gives you. And so as far as predictiveness goes, right? Like in a way, I don't know if I fully answered your question because I almost treated it more like a backward looking thing, right? Trying to look at once you have the violation history of a few years, but it helps you, I think, understand who's who in terms of corporate culture. If you can actually trace companies back a few years and figure out who's got a sort of consistent pattern, who's likely to do it again versus which companies that just had some bad luck and learned from it.
Thanks, Anish. Really interesting stuff. Again, I'm going to go to the sort of gallery view so I can see everybody. And in a moment, I'm going to invite Alistair Ramage, if he wants to put the very interesting note that he made in the chat, to bring that to life. Alistair, if you'd like to, perhaps turn that into a question. And it's a really good conversation point. So Alistair, we'll come to you in a moment, but I can see Mr. Nigel Cairns has got his hand up. Nigel, please, first of all, take an opportunity to introduce yourself and share your thought. Thank you, Nigel.
Hi, everybody. I'm a victim of bank misconduct. The case has been going on for 10 years. So over that period, I've gained quite a bit of knowledge about the subject matters that we're engaged with. My question has to do with the introduction of UK Violation Tracker, and I'm interested to know the views on the approach expected by big financial firms, i.e. the banks and other firms that are featured in the rundown that Andy's just given us, in respect to what evasive actions you think that they may want to take, assuming that they've taken notice of the effect of the UK active impact of Violation Tracker. A lot of these big firms have departments dedicated to escape and evasion of the very thing that you're trying to expose. So are we going to have a little bit of cat and mouse? Are we going to see greater use of banks using non-disclosure agreements and all the other methods that historically that they've used to evade data coming into the public domain that they think may harm their reputations? I'm just interested to hear if they think, if people think that that's something that we should be paying attention to.
Nigel, I personally think you've opened up a really interesting conversation point. You really have. Let's go to Greg, then Phil and Anish to share their thoughts on that. So, Greg, Phil, Anish, how is big business going to respond to Violation Tracker? Are they going to start to try to, in some way, defend themselves or justify the data? What do you think they might do? I guess another way of framing the question is, how have companies responded to Violation Tracker US in the US? Because perhaps the folks in the UK will do something similar. Interesting stuff. Greg, to you first.
So look, human nature includes, the propensity for misconduct, and it expresses itself through corporate governance. Although we wish things were moving faster here, I think that the cumulative weight of having the evidence of recidivism can only strengthen groups like TTF and plaintiffs like yourself, Nigel, and others who are arguing for more meaningful penalties, bigger financial penalties, personal liability for corporate executives and directors. Those at the end of the day are going to be the things that really change behavior, right? When the risks are higher for the perps, the perpetrators. And we hope that our databases are the prime, exhibit A in favoring those reforms. We certainly know that in some cases, because they've contacted us, some companies are looking at their own reputation and they're looking at their rivals. I had a hilarious email one day from Bank of America saying, why haven't you added that Wells Fargo case yet? Subtext, Bank of America will look less terrible when Wells Fargo's numbers are added to the new tally, right? And we know reputation defense firms are among the users of the US data. And obviously, some of their clients are going to take the advice to clean up their act so that they don't get dinged anymore. Some companies are redeemable and are led by people that are ethical and trying to do the right thing. But we have no illusions, especially about the big boys and the big banks.
Greg, thank you very much. And Phil, what would you like to say to this point?
First, I would point out that all of the cases that we have in both databases are already in the public domain. We're not exposing any of these cases for the first time. So that, I think, limits the extent, the kind of impact that our information may have. What we're doing is putting it all together and showing the aggregate amounts. And we're hoping that that has a different effect than the cases looked at in isolation. It remains to be seen how much it will change company behavior. What I'm actually interested more in is the changes that it might have in the behavior, for example, of prosecutors.
Right.
Recently, our Justice Department in the US announced that it was going to take a kind of a tougher stance with regard to repeat offenders or recidivists. And one of the things that the Deputy Attorney General mentioned in a speech that she gave was that they were going to look at companies that have had a case with the Justice Department in which they were kind of put under probation, you might say, for having committed an offense and were ordered to kind of change their behavior. In the past, there wasn't much follow-up on those agreements to make sure that companies were complying. She said that now under the Biden Justice Department, they are going to look more closely at whether companies are complying, but also look not only at their behavior in the area for which they were prosecuted, but their behavior in other areas. So I don't know whether Violation Tracker had any influence over this decision. I'd like to think so. They didn't consult us before announcing this change in policy, but we certainly hope that a Violation Tracker in the US can be useful to prosecutors as they decide to adopt a tougher stance toward these kinds of rogue corporations.
Thanks, Phil. Really, really interesting stuff. And Anish, any comments about this matter to do with how big business might retaliate, so to speak, once the truth is out there about the data in the database?
I mean, that's harder for me to say much about in that I sort of, so one thing that I think is interesting is that we, as Greg and Phil have pointed out, investors are using the database. right? And they are using it pretty regularly. And it's hard to say what they're doing with it, but there's clearly interest, right? If you just look at the IP address logs or they can't, I don't know who's subscribed to it, but I know you guys have some, right? Presumably they're using it for something. As far as business retaliating, I'm not sure. I guess I have a harder time thinking of how they would respond. And I think these examples of trying to go after their rivals might actually be a more typical response. I don't know how commonly you see it, but I'm honestly curious to see what happens. And I wonder if it'll be different over here too. And when sort of the US is, I think, an environment that has always had a bit more transparency than the UK in terms of putting recidivism out there, however imperfect, right? Whereas in the UK, it seems like even I'll give you an example of why I think the UK might be different. Why I don't know how to predict it, which is that in the US, once the data is out there, it tends to stay out there. It might not always be easy to access, but you can always look up. You can get data from the OSHA website itself pretty easily. You can get the individual sources. In the UK, the government, it doesn't matter who's in power, right? This isn't the political party thing. This isn't the whatever. This everyone does this. There seems to be a habit of just taking down the data, right? We put out the environmental agency sanctions, and then 6 months later, you take them down and replace them with the new sanctions. And this happens in other cases as well. HSE, we filed a freedom of information request with HSE, and they told us they had deleted their records that are more than 10 years old, and I think it was more than 5 years old in some cases, right? So and so this you have a culture of non-transparency here around corporate misconduct, and so there's more of a shift, and so that also makes it harder to predict, right? There's historically, I feel like, been less formal accountability, right? I don't know about informal accountability, but this is something that I think is going to be, having this out there is a bigger shift in the UK, but also it makes it hard for me to predict what's going to happen next. But I'm curious to see. Especially some of you might recall, sorry, I don't mean to ramble, but like some of you might recall when the Employment Tribunal decisions first went online in 2017, it was pretty controversial, right? The idea was that should these be online? Is this an invasion of privacy? Is this an invasion of individuals and firms' privacy, right? And so there's a huge debate over whether putting these online was a good thing. And this is a debate you wouldn't necessarily have with the same vigor stateside. And so I wonder if now that we have it out there, right? And of course, we don't name the individuals in these cases, just the firms. But now that this is out there, now that this is easy to access, it feels like it could be a bigger shift, assuming that there's a good user base. How people respond, I don't know, but I think it'll be interesting to see.
It is going to be fascinating to see.
It's a bigger shakeup for sure, I think.
Yeah, I think my instincts are that you're right, Anish. I think that British society is going to be more shocked by what this database shows than what's been happening on the other side of the Atlantic. We've got a great question from Sophie in the chat. Then we're going to go to Rachel Kay. Then I'm going to finally get back to Alistair to verbalise his comment in the chat as well. Sophie, if you're happy to, just come onto the screen and briefly introduce yourself and put your point to the guys about litigation funders. I think they've got something to say about that. So Sophie, if you're happy to, just come on camera and verbalise your point about litigation funders. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I hope you can see me.
Yeah.
I believe my camera is on. I'm Sophie Marginak from Client Earth. I'm a lawyer. We are a charity, public interest, environmental law organisation. I'm based in London. This is incredibly interesting and helpful database, I think, for our work, not just on environmental offences, but also around consumer law offences. We're particularly looking at greenwashing in the corporate sector at the moment, so I can see immediately that it'll be useful for that. But my thought as a lawyer is that this would be such a helpful source for litigation funders and for those class action firms and other plaintiff firms who are looking to bring cases on behalf of consumers or others that have been wronged or affected by some of this misconduct. And I was just wondering whether you had conversations with any private litigation funders or claimant firms about the database.
Thank you very much for a very well-framed question. Greg, let's go to you first. I know that you would like to say one or two things about this. You're on mute, I think, Greg, but
Yeah.
Go for it.
Not to offend the lawyers on the call, and thank you for your question, Sophie. We agree we're handing incredibly useful data on a silver platter to plaintiffs' sides attorneys on both sides of the pond now. We agree. We've had zero success raising support from attorneys, financial support for this. We think many of them are using it. A couple of pension rights advocates, especially a former professor at the at Marquette University in Wisconsin here, whose name has escaped me right now. Andy will have his name in a minute. Paul Secundo, right?
Oh, Paul Secunda. Yeah.
Secunda has openly acknowledged and been very supportive and given us a written endorsement because he thinks it's an incredibly powerful tool for his work in the pension rights area, because we have a lot of pension cases in the DC in the US data. But boy, we've gone to the Employment Lawyers Association, to some of the biggest plaintiff side firms and pled our cases. There's even a thing called Cy-Pray, right, where the sort of scraps are left over at the end of cases, and we can't even get lawyers to consider us for Cy-Pray leftovers. So if you have any hooks or hints on secret passwords or the secret handshakes that we've missed somewhere, we'd love to talk to you.
Thank you, Greg. Sophie, I know your firm well enough to know that it has the kind of ethics and purposefulness mindset that makes it a really, really strong contender to be a super user of this database. I was speaking to your colleague, Joe, the other day about a number of things relating to this. My hunch is this could be right up your street. It really could. We'll fix up a conversation and just kind of kick that about. It might be that you've got some good ideas about how the guys and girls in Washington, DC might be able to have the right kind of conversations with the right kind of organizations to hopefully get some real traction in that space, because it's obvious. It's an absolute treasure chest for them. Greg, I don't know if you mentioned it earlier, but how many hits a month roughly does a database get in the US? Because I want everyone to understand just how well used a tool it is over there.
Yeah, so it's a little tricky to tell because of the use of bots, but we're getting 3 to 4+ million page views a month on the US database. And we know before Google Analytics was degraded that we had an extremely diverse, to Anish's point about reading the user URLs, you can only figure out a small fraction of the users who enter via workplace servers, but we knew then that we had a huge rainbow of the regulators themselves, academics, journalists, labor unions, all kinds of corporate interests, manufacturers, reputation defense firms, law firms, accounting firms, site location consultants, state and local governments here in the stateside, using it as benchmarks, using it to vet companies. We love that fantastic rainbow of users.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you very much. And Sophie, again, thank you for opening up a very interesting line of conversation. Let's jump to Rachel Kay, and then we'll go to Alistair Ramage. Rachel, please do take a moment to introduce yourself and your firm. It's another organisation rated very, very highly by myself and my colleagues at the Transparency Task Force. Please take a moment to tell everybody a bit about yourself and your firm, and then jump to whatever it is you'd like to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, for the lovely introduction. It's a comment rather than a question. So just to introduce myself first, though, I'm a researcher at the High Pay Centre, which is a UK think tank looking at the causes and consequences of economic inequality, and particularly looking at executive pay, but also a kind of broader focus on corporate employment practices. And I was really interested in what you were saying, Anish, about short-term financial incentives, because that's something that we look at a lot, particularly regarding executive pay and the impact of those short-term financial incentives on how companies treat their workers and try to cut costs. So also, just to say, this is a really interesting conversation, and that the violation tracker database is going to be really useful for us, because periodically we do research into corporate reporting on workforce related issues, and there's obviously not much in annual reports about corporate misconduct at all. So this will really add valuable information to our research on that. But the comment was just really that there's been some discussion discussion already about the recidivism and the reasons behind it. And I would say that I think a big reason behind it is the short-term financial incentives that Anish was talking about, and the shareholder primacy that we've seen since the 80s. I think regulation is really important, but it's not just about that, and it's not just about having bigger penalties. I think we do need to think about how to shift companies towards prioritizing long-term value creation, which is obviously a big question and not the topic of this discussion. But I just wanted to add that point to sort of the reasons behind recidivism. I think it's actually something quite deep and structural about how companies think about their stakeholders and think about financial incentives and so on.
Well said, Rachel. Well said. I think everybody on this call will be in absolute agreement with you about the need for less primacy of shareholders and more engagement. The whole idea of a multi-stakeholder society. Whenever people talk about incentives, as you've just done, Rachel, it always brings to mind that Charlie Munger quotation, which to my mind explains 90% of human behaviour. The quotation, of course, is "Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome." And at the moment, we have an ecosystem of business where the incentives are short-term gain, short-term share price hikes, short-term bonuses, and as a consequence, there's a long list of casualties, including the planet, that are paying a price for that. Thank you, Rachel. Let's jump to Alistair, if we may. Alistair, you put a note in the chat about the difficulties of prediction. I get your point, but you've got a chance now, if you like, Alistair, to just kind of verbalise that and make your points in a more kind of engaging way. Go for it, Alistair. Thank you. And of course, start off with a brief introduction to yourself. That would be good. Thanks.
Well, thanks very much. And first off, thank you very much for hosting us, and excited to see Violation Tracker launching in the UK. I think it's really, really interesting. Very quickly, I'm an engineer who's spent the last 20 years doing systemic change work, often with the public sector, sometimes as a public servant and as an employee of the public sector. And as at the moment, sometimes as a professional services side of the fence, advising people, buyers, suppliers, and all sorts of other things, whether it's prison reform or pandemic responses or all sorts of other things. So very, very interested in how organisations take decisions. I work now in an organisation, Arca Blanca, which is consulting and data science mashed together. We do a lot of work with AI, with big data, doing forecasting tools, forecasting capabilities, and decision automation. There was a question at the point I put this note up in the chat around forecasting. Forecasting, particularly with modern data tools, is incredibly straightforward within a context. And the thing to watch out for most of all, this point about black swans and Graham's question, the thing to watch for is when the context changes. My suspicion is that Violation Tracker in the UK is going to be absolute gold dust for the tabloid press when writing a piece involving a company to double check the source and then work out the pattern of behaviour. The interesting thing that happens when stories get picked up by the press, and we've seen this a few times with criminal justice, where particular things are then introduced as so-and-so, a person's law in response to a particular event, is it changes the context. It creates a discontinuity. So a black swan is when something not easy to forecast occurs and changes the dynamic. A pandemic, for instance, actually very forecastable, but not the date and not the disease. But that we were due a pandemic, I think, is reasonably obvious when you look at historic data. Using data, what we now do is routinely pick several dozen sources, mash them up in an AI model and start to build forecasting. This data source will be very useful to us in certain, particularly ESG decision support and strategy setting contexts. What I wanted to say in the comment was really that it's very, very easy to incorporate data sources such as this, scrape them using AI into much bigger data patterns to make forecasts. The really interesting problem I think you have created, it's a great problem, by pulling this stuff into the sunlight, you're going to change behaviours. By changing behaviours, you're changing the context. By changing the context, you make forecasting very difficult. So, before I disappear further into a logic loop, I will stop. But that's all I had intended with that statement. Very, very useful, very, very powerful. But I think the context will change, and therefore forecasting beware.
Wonderful. I think you've made a great point there about the whole idea that once behaviour is being observed, behaviour will change. I think that's the gist of what you're saying. I get that. I absolutely get that. Thanks, Alistair. That's really interesting. We're going to go to Thomas Wills, and then we're going to go to Jenny Herrera for their thoughts. Thomas, please take the opportunity to introduce yourself, your organisation, and your initial thoughts about Violation Tracker coming to the UK.
Absolutely. Thanks, Angie. And thanks also to Greg and Phil for the great work of getting this off the ground. It's been really interesting to watch Violation Tracker kind of plan a launch and then launch, and it seems to have turned out to be a really strong resource. I come from the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre. We, in some ways, perform a complementary function to Violation Tracker in that we focused on our website, and I've just put the website in the chat, a big database of corporate misdeeds that is compiled not in a systemic or kind of data-driven way, but rather based on things we've heard about, people we're working with, and therefore we aspire to provide a similar resource that approaches things from a slightly different angle in terms of corporate misdeeds. I've just got a couple of quick observations in terms of the implications of what Violation Tracker does. And in some ways they're a repetition of what's gone before, but just in the 5 minutes before this call, just looking at the database, 2 insights, if you like. The first, that we have, in many cases, inadequate incentives that are in terms of how regulatory agencies work in this country. Looking at the last 10 years of the operation of the GLA, or what's now the Gang Masters and Labour Abuse Authority, there are 34 findings against companies, adding up to, I've slightly lost the window now, but it's £19,000 worth of fines in the last 10 years. And that's even based on 10 years of supposed focus from this government in the UK on modern slavery and on the kind of modern slavery and labour abuse agenda. So we can see that the rhetoric really hasn't been matched by regulatory action. The other comment is that there are huge gaps in the, it's not just how the regulation is being enacted by agencies, there are also huge gaps. We already mentioned, Anish mentioned it, the Boohoo case, and extending it out from that, a huge number of cases of fast fashion brands abusing human rights overseas and in the UK. And that's something that we've all known about for decades. And yet, I think that when I just did a quick search, there were 4 findings on the whole database against parent companies that focus on apparel. So that shows that we have huge gaps in our regulation. I really hope that from the work of researchers, organisations such as mine, other organisations on the call, in the coming years, we can use the data available here on this database to start to elaborate and bring and give weight to these basic, quite broad arguments. But thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Thomas. Thank you. We're going to go to Jenny Herrera shortly. Jenny's with the Good Business Charter, which I guess is what this is all about, really, companies behaving the right way. But just before we go to Jenny, again, I'm going to go to gallery view so I can see everybody. Wave your hand if you'd like to make a point at this stage. Otherwise, we'll go to Jenny.
Oh, Andy, I just wanted to make a comment about Thomas's presentation, which is that I agree that Violation Tracker UK and the Business and Human Rights Resource Center database are complementary. I mean, I'm a longtime user of your database, Thomas, and there are differences in approaches, but I think they together they give a bigger picture of corporate misconduct, overall. So we should talk some more about how to coordinate, our efforts.
That sounds great. the idea of 1 and 1 adding up to more than 2 sounds like a great idea. The scope for collaboration and augmentation is wonderful. So let's go to Jenny, and then if you don't mind, Sophie, I'm going to pick on you again because you've just put a really nice phrase in the chat, the enforcement gap. I know what you mean by it, but it's going to be lovely to hear you verbalize the significance of that, because that enforcement gap is definitely something we see big time in the financial services sector. Regulators not actually enforcing according to the powers that they've got. But let's go to Jenny first of all, then we'll jump to Sophie. Jenny, to you.
Great, thanks, Andy. Yeah, I run the Good Business Charter, and what we do is we measure businesses' behaviour across 10 different components, 5 around employees, and then there's tax, environment, customers, ethical sourcing, and prompt payment to suppliers. But what I think is great about this is that, yes, we're measuring on specific things, asking specific questions, but in the background, we want to know that a business is behaving responsibly in regard to the law. And so actually, and because we're a small charity, to be able to have everything in one place is just phenomenal for us. So it's really exciting to be able to think, right, as part of our accreditation process, we do have to take stuff on trust, but here is a really important thing where we can make that check, and where there are violations, we can then go back to that person and thrash it out. And maybe it's something in the past and they've put in some processes to make sure it doesn't recur. But on these examples where you're seeing it just become normal and like it's cheaper for them to pay the fine than to sort out the problem, then how can we be accrediting a business who's doing that? So it really useful.
Fantastic. And Jenny, I know I'm kind of putting words in your mouth, but isn't it amazing that it's free? I mean, this would be worth paying for, isn't it? So isn't it fantastic that it's free? Thanks,
really
Jenny.
Is, and it would be worth paying for. So yeah, it's just a great resource for us.
Thanks, Jenny. I'm going to remember that point you just made when we come to talk about endorsements and testimonials and comments of support in a minute. But before we do that, let's jump back to Sophie. Sophie, tell us about this phrase you used, that the enforcement gap. Tell us about that and why is it significant in this conversation today? Thank you.
So I think speaking from our experience with in the UK, and particularly with the UK financial regulator, so Client Earth has filed, I think now, 11 complaints with the FCA in relation to inadequate and we say misleading climate risk and environmental disclosure by UK listed companies. And essentially the response from the FCA in each of those occasions, despite the huge focus on climate risk from the UK government, from the current Chancellor, from the pensions Department of Work and Pensions regulator over the years, the FCA still didn't see itself as, it was clear that in our conversations with them, they didn't see themselves as being the policeman or as being an active regulator. They see themselves as simply monitoring self-regulation by the sector. And I think this is really helpful. And I'm not sure whether you have gone to the FCA, but I think, Andy, you clearly pointed out that there's this pattern of recidivism amongst the banks. I think this is really helpful data to take to the regulators or to government when petitioning government to actually put more pressure on or to provide the resource that the FCA and other financial sector regulators need to actually do their jobs even more effectively.
Well put. Thank you so much. We're going to start bringing things to a close. I mean, we're kind of formally finishing at 5 o'clock UK time, but we can carry on for another 5-10 minutes. We're quite relaxed about that if people have got other things that they'd like to talk about and discuss. But before we kind of open it up to sort of final comments and questions or ideas that people may have, I'd like to, if I may, briefly set out a few potential actions which you're invited to consider taking. You may want to do this, you may not want to do this. And these are really just ideas. We haven't even sort of talked them through properly with Greg and Phil and their colleagues in Washington, DC. One idea is the idea of a user group. The way I imagine that is that a number of individuals and organizations who are, if you like, enthusiasts for the Violation Tracking UK database might meet on, let's say, a quarterly basis and just kick around ideas or talk about how they've used the data. So if you may be interested in becoming part of that user group, if there was to be one, then let us know in reply to the email we'll circulate afterwards. The second idea is comments of support. The best possible way that we can make the world aware that Violation Tracker UK exists is by way of social media. And the best possible way of leveraging the power of social media is if we have comments of support. So again, everybody's going to be invited to provide a comment of support if they'd like to. We've already got some absolutely first-class comments from all kinds of people. And frankly, the more of those kind of comments we get, the better it's going to be. Third idea, very simple. You may well have thoughts about how the data could be used. For example, in an academic report or in a white paper of some kind. What might you want to do in relation to that? And finally, we'll make sure you're aware of all the other events coming up. Now that you know about Violation Tracker UK, hopefully you like it. Hopefully you're going to want colleagues and contacts to also become aware of it. And please do invite those folks to participate in the remaining 5 other events we've got lined up over the course of the next week or so. So that pretty much takes it to top of the hour. There's no hard close. We can carry on chatting if you'd like to. Let me first of all go to Phil and Greg and Anish to see if there's any final comments they'd like to make before we open up for any remaining chat that we'd like to have. So Greg, to you first of all, any final thoughts for yourself, please, Greg?
No, I just want to say we're so pleased by the rollout. We certainly have a much more full-bodied and robust movement of people around this rollout than we did in the US. It was kind of a lonely event 6 years ago when we did it first in the US. But thanks to Andy and so many people on this call and on the other calls, we're having a big warm bear hug to get launched here. And I'm sure that's going to augur well for the use and success of the database.
Thanks, Greg. Thank you very much indeed. As you know, everybody we've ever spoken to about this Violation Tracker database just absolutely loves it. It's a real winner. You know, one day along the list of fantastic United States products that people got to know about in the UK, there's going to be Levi's jeans, Harley Davidson motorbikes, Coca-Cola, and Violation Tracker. It's only a matter of time. It's only a matter of time. Thanks, Greg. Let's go to Phil. Phil, any final comments from you, sir?
Yeah, I'm not sure I want to be on that list, but with Coca-Cola, but anyway, but I appreciate the sentiment. So yes, well, thanks to everybody. I'm also pleased at the response that the database has received, and it's our plan to to make it even better. We want to add additional categories of information. For example, in the U.S. Site, we've got lots of not only data from regulators, but data from private litigation, particularly these class action lawsuits, multi-district lawsuits in the US. Now, I know that's not as big a deal in the UK, but there is some of that. And we want to capture the information that is available. And if we're missing any regulatory agencies, please let us know, and we'll find that information, and of course we'll keep all of our sources up to date, as new cases are announced in the weeks and months ahead.
Great stuff. Thank you very much indeed, Phil. Anish, sir, to you for your final thoughts.
I mean, I don't really have anything beyond what's already been said. I mean, I think it's an interesting tool. It'll get better. As we learn more about the regulatory environment here, of course, we can draw upon more and more sources as we, learn more about the court system here and what data we have and what we can get. We'll hopefully keep building it out. And then, of course, hopefully if and when the enforcement gap starts to get filled in, thanks to the work of a lot of the organizations here and related, then maybe we'll, in the future, have more sources upon which we can even draw. So, we'll see where that goes.
Fantastic. Does anybody have any final comments they'd like to make before
Thomas is waving his hand. Go ahead, Thomas.
I didn't see that. Thomas, thank you.
That's right. I just had a quick direct question to Phil on the question about updates. Is there a weekly, monthly, quarterly thing? Does it regularly scrape and update whenever anything is updated in terms of regulatory agencies' releases? How does it work?
Well, mainly we'll be updating on a quarterly basis. And as my colleague Anthony here knows, it's a very labor-intensive process of going to all the different sources, collecting the new cases, putting them in standard format, and then doing the parent subsidiary matching. So we're not using data feeds, or AI to collect our data. This is, kind of human intelligence and human effort to put this together. And at the moment, quarterly updating is what seems most realistic.
That's great, thanks.
And anybody else before I wrap things up? In which case, I'm pretty sure everyone is going to be very happy to join me in thanking Greg and Phil and Anthony and Anish and the colleague Arlene and everybody else who've worked very, very hard over the last year and a half to make this possible. Thank you so much for bringing Violation Tracker to the UK. Well done, guys. Very, very well done, guys. Thank you. Super stuff. We'll wrap it up there, folks. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you very much indeed. Well done.
Next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.